Hey humans, how's it going? Susan Ruth here. Thanks for listening to another episode of Hey Human Podcast. This is episode 169, and I went out to Redmond, Washington, and sat down with Arik Cohen. And the fact that Arik even exists is statistically astronomical. He is the grandson of 4 individuals who survived the Holocaust. There's definitely a trigger warning for this episode. It gets very intense, but I encourage everyone to listen, of course. And for those of you with families and such, listen to this episode and then go back and listen with your kids, your siblings, family members, whatever, and your friends, and talk about it. Talk about this experience that Arik's grandparents had. I think it's important to talk about it. He made a website, what-word-the-odds.com, and you can see pictures of his grandparents and see maps and see the experience of what he talks about through pictures and a timeline. And so I really encourage you to check that out as well. There's also pictures of thank you cards that he gets from kids when he goes to talk at schools about this subject, and those are really neat to see as well. And of course, there'll be the link to that on heyhumanpodcast.com's webpage, so on the links page. So definitely check that out. Yeah, there's a lot here. It was intense, and I kept it together pretty well during this conversation. And then after it was done, I hugged him goodbye, and I walked to my car and got in my car, shut the door, and I just started sobbing. It's hard to wrap your head around this atrocity and all the atrocities that happen worldwide. It's hard to wrap your head around the way human beings are willing to treat each other. And the Holocaust, of course, is this grand scale of how horrible human beings can treat each other. It's also a beautiful example of perseverance and the desire to stay alive, the ability to choose hope and to see freedom even in the worst of circumstances. It's a lot. It's a lot to take in, and it's an important story to hear, 4 stories to hear. I'm honored that Arik said yes when I asked him to be on the show. And so that's that. Just the usual stuff. Hey Human Podcast, of course, is on social media, on Instagram and Facebook. You can find me under Susan Ruthism all over social media. My website is susanruth.com. If you're an Amazon shopper, please do so through the Amazon portal on Hey Human's website, because it helps support Hey Human and keep it ad-free. You can email me, susan@heyhumanpodcast.com. I'd love to hear from you. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Rate and review Hey Human on iTunes. Super helpful. That would be great. And yeah, let's get into this. And thank you for listening. And take care of each other. Here we go. Arik Cohen, welcome to Hey Human.
Thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, and actually, I'm glad to be here. We are on the Microsoft campus in Redmond, Washington. My mind is blown already at this place.
Yeah, it's a little crazy here. We have an awful lot of people doing it, and it's a fun place to come to work. It's an interesting. It's been an interesting ride here.
Just trying to find this building was in and of itself a map. Crazy.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a challenge of figuring out which of the 6 entrances you can get into.
Yeah.
And you're lucky that we didn't schedule this on a Monday, because the new employee orientation happens in the next building over, and then you have no parking.
I bet that's fun to see, though. Like college, first day of college.
Yeah, you see a whole train of younger kids coming in, which is fun.
Yeah.
We also had, luckily you didn't get stuck in the largest underground parking garage west of the Mississippi.
For real?
Which if you go around the building, there's an entrance into it. It's 5 floors down with
subterranean parking.
It's like something like 4,000 spots, 4,500 spots of parking.
Is that where the mole people live?
I don't know, but I know that every once a week I go, where's my car?
Oh, man.
It's like, which floor did I park on?
Yeah.
So,
I imagine
we figure it out.
That would be confusing. Well, it's quite a campus. It's beautiful.
It is.
Yeah, it's stunning. I just want to walk up to everyone and say, what are you working on right now?
Yeah, most people would be pretty happy to tell you, and I think they enjoy it. So, Tuesdays in the summer they have a farmer's market out here. It's ridiculous.
The Microsoft farmers. Would you like to buy my robot?
No, it's the local Redmond one. Yeah, it's like hey, if I bring back the pins, I get the things from the pints of raspberries. I get a better deal next week.
There you go. Or this robot makes homebrew.
I haven't seen that one
future.
here. Yeah,
it
is. Probably.
Well, okay, so we are here because Kim, our mutual, it's my brother's friends, but I met Kim and Scott Harlan at a get-together and saw the treehouse.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Holy moly.
By the way, we have 3 tree houses here on campus, too, that have conference rooms. We should have probably booked to do it in one of those.
Oh, so cool. Oh.
It gets a little warm in the summer, though.
This is quite the empire, for sure. But so Kim, we were sitting around the little fire, and Kim said, tell me about your podcast. So I filled her in a little bit, and she said, you should talk to my friend Arik. I said, okay. So she told me a little bit about your story. 1 in 10 million? Is that what it was? Or 4 in 10 million?
For me, the story started out, so Kim actually was the preschool teacher for a couple of my sons.
Okay.
And I actually, I guess it's about 5 years ago, started volunteering at the local Holocaust Center for Humanity. And I tell the story of all 4 of my grandparents that are survivors. And I work at Microsoft here. I'm a geek by nature, so I took a kind of geeky view of how it looks and said, hey, people said it's really rare that all 4 of your grandparents were survivors, and it never really crossed my mind that was rare, right? I mean, I had 4 grandparents. That's a pretty normal thing. It happened to my brother. He had the same thing, right? It can't be that rare. And so I went and started trying to do the math as I learned more about their stories. And for me, the big challenge was they didn't talk about it. So they didn't talk about it with their kids. They didn't talk about it with their grandkids.
Which camps were they in?
Depends on which side. So on my mom's side, they never were in any of the camps. They were in Lithuania. So they were in ghettos. That's where my grandparents met. In Yiddish, it's the Shabli ghetto. It's the I'll butcher the name in Lithuanian, but it's I think Suali ghetto there, which was the 3rd largest ghetto in Lithuania, and they were in that ghetto for just over 2.5 years for my grandfather, or close to 3 years, and 3.5 years for my grandmother, and then they lived in the forest. They basically ran away and lived in forest and stuff for 6 months. On the other side, my grandparents on my father's side were a more kind of traditional story that we would hear. So they are from the Transylvania area in Romania. When they were born, it was Hungary. Now it's Romania. And they were sent to Auschwitz, where they were separated. My grandmother got sent to Stutthof after a while and was part of the death march out of there. My grandfather was sent to Buchenwald. And was, we believe, working in a oil refinery there that was constantly getting bombed. And then they got reunited after the war, as they each got kind of separated and back together that way. But so my grandfather's story is actually it tracks very closely on major points with Elie Wiesel and Night. So if you've ever read Night, Elie Wiesel, I guess Nobel Peace Prize winner, and that was younger than my grandfather, but he was processed in Auschwitz on the same day. and he was liberated at Buchenwald on the same day. So don't know that they knew each other. Like, I didn't find this out until 35 years after 35 years after my grandfather passed away, so I never had a chance to ask him. But they were in similar spots. So some of the ways I've been trying to figure stuff out and trying to do the research and learn about it has been kind of reading about this, finding sources here, finding sources there, and it ends up that once you go, and I'm not sure that my stats professor would agree with the way I did the stats, but I've got a nice spreadsheet that shows how it all comes down. It ends up being about 1 in 930 million chance that all 4 of my grandparents survived.
Wow. Extraordinary. All right, I'm going to take this bit by bit because it's a lot of information, obviously. Let's start back at the ghetto. Mm-hmm. I don't know that a lot of people know what that means, so will you explain that?
Well, it probably even makes sense to start even a little bit before that.
Great.
So my grandfather, Aryeh, I was named after him, and Aryeh is also kind of my legal name, but I've been going by Arik.
Oh, Arik. See, I already pronounced it wrong.
Okay. As I describe it, my mom and my wife pronounce it differently, so I respond to anything even.
Arik.
Yeah.
That's much more beautiful than. No offense to all the Eriks in the world.
No, it is not Arik, but close enough that it can be pronounced in Texas.
Arik. That's really lovely, though.
He was from a small village called Saucony. It was Shukyan in Yiddish. So Yiddish is the language that was primarily spoken by the Jews in a bunch of Eastern Europe. It was a mishmash of German and Polish and Romanian, and they had been pushed out of many different places, so they had kind of their own language. Hebrew wasn't a language that was spoken at home. It was like Latin. It was a prayer language, and it was used at synagogue, but it wasn't used for day-to-day purposes. So
my grandparents, my father's parents, spoke Yiddish to each other, and when they got mad, it was...
It's entertaining. But I guess there's like Yiddish theater and stuff that's still going strong. In fact, maybe going to go see a Yiddish performance of Fiddler in the Roof in New York that is supposed to be pretty good in a couple weeks. But so he was from a town called Shukyan, and it had about 1,000 people before the war in 1940, and about half of the population was Jewish. Now, he was from probably one of the wealthier families in town. Why? His family ran the lumber mill. So they had a fish pond, they had the house, they had the lumber mill. He had worked before taking over the family lumber mill. When his father passed away, he was working as a forester. So he had a lot of kind of outdoorsy experience, which served him incredibly well moving forward. But in July of 1941, the Germans basically rolled through Lithuania, and they came to the folks in the village on a Friday evening, at the beginning of the Sabbath, so the beginning of kind of the rest and that. When no one's supposed to work, and the ruling council came to kind of the Jewish elders and said, "We need you guys to come up with 50,000 rubles, otherwise we're supposed to send you out to these work camps, and you have 24 hours." 50,000 rubles in 1941 equates to about $800,000 today, roughly. Somewhere between 600,000 and 900,000, depending on how you look at exchange rates and things like that. There's about 150 families in town. So go get 150 families who are in a small farming village in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the forest in Lithuania, to come up with 800 grand in 24 hours. Somehow they scraped up the stuff that their jewelry, their silverware, all kinds of stuff, and were able to kind of placate people. The next morning, so that was, they give it over on Saturday. The next morning, on Sunday morning, everyone is greeted by folks with Lithuanian folks with guns. Say, hey, gather your stuff and go to the synagogue, which is a wooden synagogue It was considered one of the, it's one of the few things I've been able to find pictures of from before the war, of the wooden synagogue in Shukyan.
I'd love to see those pictures.
Yeah, I will. I've got a bunch of random material, they basically.
I'm sorry. What is ticking? Is there a bomb in here? Do you hear that?
I do hear the ticking. I don't know. Is that the? Is that?
Is it a clock? What is that?
I wonder if it's the lights. Let me see.
They show up.
They show up. They get basically sent to the synagogue.
Does that mean that the money that they gave was?
It was just basically a bribe.
Yeah, but they took the money and
they took the money and they said, yeah, no, oh yeah, oops, sorry, didn't mean that. So took them to the synagogue, and then they later that day took them about 3 kilometers out of town to an abandoned farm, a farm where actually it was owned by some Jewish folks that were sent to when the Russians were running Lithuania in between, had got sent to Siberia. So it was an abandoned kind of that, and there they basically pulled out all of the men, all the women and children, and put them inside kind of the farmhouse, and the kind of the older kids and that as well. And then they pulled out 4 men. One of them is my grandfather, and the person who had took over as forester had been trying to get him. It had been about 3 weeks since the Germans had rolled through Lithuania and said, hey, we hear that Jews probably aren't going to be allowed to own stuff and things like that. Why don't you sign over the lumber mill and the fish pond and that to me, and I'll make sure your family gets taken care of. My grandfather, my mom says I get some of my stubbornness from him. He didn't do it. But so he got pulled aside. A guy who was a leather maker in the town that was doing some work for some of the Lithuanians, a tanner, was pulled aside. 2 people that were doing construction work on one of the key Lithuanians in town, they got pulled aside. Basically, who were the men that got pulled out? The ones that somebody wanted something from. They were locked in the house, and everybody else was basically out in the. So there's about 500-ish, 550 Jews living in Shukyan that were all kind of gathered here. About 130 people go into the house. About 400 are out in the kind of yard and that. They go to bed. The next morning they wake up. There's nobody in the yard. And my grandfather starts asking questions. What's going on? And he's told that they were sent off to some work camps. And a guy comes by who wasn't a landowner, but he was someone who had a horse and cart. So it was someone that my grandfather knew because he had used him to do a lot of deliveries from lumber mill, right? And he turned to him and the guy's crying, goes, I didn't know. He goes, what do you mean you didn't know? I didn't know. And he gets from him the story that actually they weren't taken to out there. They were taken about another 3 miles out into the woods where there was a pit that was dug, and there's a mass grave of 400 people. So the only reason my grandfather isn't at that point in that grave is because someone wanted something from him. And the amazing thing for me on this was we knew that growing up, I knew that my grandfather survived from his village because just about everybody in the village was killed in kind of one of these mass pits. What I always understood was there's stories of people that dove in as shots were going and then crawled out in the middle of the night and survived. And that's the story my mom told me. That's the story my mom thought she knew. When I started doing the research, I found out that in the 1950s, my grandfather did an interview that no one in the family knew about, that got in Israel, where they went after the war. It got translated to Hebrew. Somebody else translated it to English, and about 10, 15 years ago, somebody put that up on the web. So when I started doing research, all of a sudden I found an interview with my grandfather that he tells the story. So my mom's like, I've been telling, my mom was a teacher for 43 years. She's like, I've been telling the wrong story the entire time. And so it's fascinating for me as I go through this, how much stuff I've learned that I found that at probably 1 o'clock in the morning here It was 3 o'clock in the morning in Dallas when I called my mom to let her know that I found stuff from her father. It was a little bit better when I called my aunt in Israel because that time shift. But it was kind of like, where did this come from, right? Like, where did we get this information?
And how old is he at this moment?
He is in his late 20s. So he was born, I believe it's 1910. Oh no, early 30s. So 31-ish. 31, 32.
Firstly, I think about that in your 20s. Imagine all of that happening around you, and you're 20-something years old. It's mind-boggling.
It's incomprehensible.
Yeah.
I take a look at it. I forget about at that age. I'm not sure what age it would be comprehensible.
No, exactly. But especially at that. It hits awfully close to home. They got sent at that point. Everyone who survived. So
got
the women,
split.
the children,
the women, the children, four men got sent.
God, can you imagine the guilt that survived in that moment, even.
And they don't quite know what happened, right? They know what one guy told them happened.
Sure.
They don't really. The kind of recurring understanding that I get out of hearing survivors and hearing and researching the stories is no one could actually comprehend that something that catastrophic, that evil, that final could be happening. So even when they heard parts of it, it can't be real, right? Is kind of the general perspective that I think an awful lot of people had. Well, somebody must be exaggerating. No one could be that bad, right? And it's an interesting. I look at things that happen in the world today, and I go, how much of it how much? Now we have much easier access to a lot more information that we doubt just as much.
Yeah, for sure. And also, the existence of a Hitler is not a new thing, nor will it. It has repeated itself. Hitler killed a lot of people in a long amount of time comparatively to some.
He was very efficient.
He was efficient, but he had a lot of time to do it too, right? But there are. In other countries, like the Bosnia, the killing fields, like the Chechnya, like all this stuff, they're killing massive amounts of people in much shorter amounts of time.
Genocide hasn't stopped.
No.
Right? And one of the things that, as I've learned more about it, it takes about 30 years for the survivors of genocide to start talking about it, what happened at all, on average. So only now are we starting to hear about the stuff that happened in the 80s and 90s, right? So Cambodia, Darfur, Bosnia.
Yes.
And
this stuff's been going on. That's why I get nervous when our president uses words like vermin. And it's very reflective of the language used in the 30s to start the campaigning of making a person subhuman.
Yep. Anytime you can separate people out, and especially you can separate people out and blame them for some of your some of your problems.
Right.
There is it is a tried and true political tactic. Most of the time, not rising to levels of atrocity, just ridiculousness, but it is a.
But if left unchecked, terrifying results. All right, so he's 20-something, and now where are there?
Yeah, so now he gets sent up to basically a city on the border between Lithuania and Latvia, a town called Zagreb, which is where they gathered a bunch of the Jews. And this is where Jews in the area.
Jews. That's a Freudian slip.
Yeah,
it was a zoo, I'm sure.
It was a zoo. There were about just over 3,000 people in this ghetto. And the ghetto is a enclosed area where they basically forced you to live and work inside that enclosed area. In general, they were incredibly crowded. They were poor sanitation, poor food, poor everything. Take the people in that are living in a particular area and now enclose them and remove some of their rights. They need to have passes and
They wore
controls.
the stars.
There they were. I believe they were wearing stars in Lithuania at the time. It was adopted at various different points in time in different countries. But my grandfather, since he knew a bunch of forestry stuff and that, he got a job that was outside the ghetto walls. So he so he basically was able to get in and out of the ghetto. And Zagreb is famous also because the ghetto there, there's stories that come out where, and this is true in most of the ghettos, one of the big things that they were really trying to do was to dehumanize the people that are inside the ghetto and make them feel like they have absolutely no control. So a story that I don't know if it's famous because I tell it. So now it's infamous, I guess. Is the chief rabbi of Zagreb, so the highest religious figure in the area, was basically forced to be at the gate when they opened up the gates in the morning, and they basically, in order to kind of break down the boundaries of who's in charge and how things happen, they would have people on their way out spit on them. They said, you have to spit on the rabbi. And the first couple people refused. So they got shot and killed right there. And what the rabbi say? Spit on me, right? Like that doesn't matter. Like in the grand scheme of things, like spit as much as you want, just survive. My grandfather, I don't know that he was part of that, but he got the him and some of the older boys from the town and the surrounding area, and a couple of the other men, they basically got jobs outside and they escaped, and they went back to the forest outside Shukyan to try to figure out what had really happened. And now they still had family and that were back in the ghetto. Food was very scarce. So now they were going to their neighbors, right? The people that they'd lived by their entire lives, and telling the stories of how tough things were there. And they were getting care packages, and they basically were doing an underground, how do we send food and smuggle stuff back in? Now, it was very dangerous to smuggle stuff back in. If you got caught smuggling, you got shot. If you didn't smuggle stuff, you starved, right? So it was kind of like it's a no-win situation. But now all of a sudden, some of the neighbors, who are the same people that were supporting the folks that kind of took the money, took them out of the house, took over their houses, right?
By
all
supporting, you mean didn't do anything?
Either didn't do or were part of the militias, right? Okay. I don't know what the exact breakdown is, but you don't move 500 people with 10, right?
Yeah, although I think about, that they came for the Jews, I said nothing. They came for the Catholics, I said nothing. They came for the Gypsies, I said nothing. They came for the disabled, I said nothing. They came for me, there was no one left to speak up for me.
And that is one of the messages that that we talk a lot about from the Holocaust Center here, of what does it mean to be an upstander? What do you do when you see someone being marginalized? And in general, I go speak at middle schools and high schools, and they're marginalized is somebody who got bullied at lunch, someone who's sitting on their own at lunch. It's not someone who necessarily was walked away at gunpoint, right? Sure. I mean, there are many different layers, and frankly, stopping it at the earlier stages is a heck of a lot easier. And what does it mean to be an upstander, to stand up in those situations? And what are the things that you can do that can drive you to make that happen? And it's an uncomfortable spot. I'd like to say that I'm perfect at it, but by no means am I. I figured what I'm doing with kind of telling my grandparents' story, and that is kind of probably my best way of trying to address some of it. But it's a tough spot for everyone to be involved in. And many times the people that stand up get put into the exact same position as the people that were being marginalized.
There are some things worth dying for, I think.
There are, and I'd like to believe that I'd make the right decision if it was placed in front of me, but I haven't jumped in front of any bullets yet, which is also why I'm here talking to you. So they were doing care packages back. The local Catholic priest actually came to them. There was about 10 of them that were kind of doing this underground, get stuff, and he says, "You guys have been members of the community for a long time. We know you. We know your families. This isn't right. What's happening? Why don't you convert? And that way, when the Germans come and say, 'Are there any Jews?' we can basically say there are none." Right? And 8 of the people there converted. My grandfather did not. Now, he wasn't a particularly religious man, from what I understand, before the war, definitely not after the war. But he was, as I mentioned, a little stubborn. I believe it's late October of 1941 now. So it's about 4 months after it's 3 months after the village was basically all the people were moved out. The ghetto in Zagreb is actually liquidated, and by that they took all, I believe it's 3,200-ish people that mostly many women and children out into the main town square, and Lithuanians and Ukrainians came out with automatic weapons from all the surrounding streets and gunned them down. The story afterwards is that the river Zagreb ran red with blood for 3 days. Now, my grandfather's not in there because he had escaped out and was trying to send care packages back. They continue sending stuff. They don't know that had happened. It's a distance of about 40 miles, so it's not massively far, but it's far enough that when you're kind of doing underground supplies, it's kind of getting passed from place to place.
So was your grandmother in that? But they had
my grandmother was in a different town.
Okay,
so they had not yet met.
Okay,
so my grandfather, on November 1st, I believe it is, it's All Saints Day, the Germans came into Shukyan, to Sakhany, came to ask for any Jews. They said there are no Jews here. They came to the Catholic priest and said, "Who's the people who have recently converted?" And shot and killed those 8 people, who are buried in the Catholic cemetery in Shukyan. And it took 60 years or so, early 2000s. There's now a memorial plaque there apologizing that they didn't do more to protect at that point. I'm not sure what else they could have done, but recognizing that. Now, they had heard that the Germans were coming through and going kind of door to door searching for people. My grandfather was in a farmer's barn staying and heard dogs barking. So he ran. And he ran about 20 miles away to the biggest city around, which is a town called Siali or Shavli in Yiddish. And that's the ghetto. He ends up at the ghetto walls. At this point, there are 3 people from his village still alive. So this is roughly 4 months after the war gets to Lithuania, and out of about 550 people, there are 3 people left alive. And he gets a job. He runs into a old family friend that he knew from when he did the kind of lumber mill and and that guy gets him a job again at a factory outside of the ghetto walls in Shavli.
Did he infiltrate the ghetto when he got there?
When he got there, they were letting Jews into the ghetto.
I wasn't sure there was checkpointy things.
I'm sure there was checkpointy things, but this was a much larger ghetto. There was anywhere between 4,000 and 7,000 people there at any point in time. It was extremely, extremely cramped. Now, Shavli is where my grandmother had settled after. So my grandmother is the most educated of all my grandparents. She was orphaned at the age of 12. Her father actually passed away before she was born. She finished off her schooling and then went to teaching college. So she became a teacher. In 1934. She was about 6 years younger than my grandfather, so she was, I think, in her mid-20s when all this came down. But she was in the big city. She was kind of nannying and teaching kindergarten, first grade, and I've got pictures of her with her class because her older sister, had emigrated to Palestine, now Israel. So all the pictures I have there are pictures that she sent to her sister before the war. So she was teaching there. When they opened up the ghetto, it became illegal to have schools in the ghetto. So she's officially listed as a factory worker. But educated. Now, I've been able to find out about your information. In May of 1942, there was a census done in Lithuania, and there was a lot of consternation between the Jews of like, should we fill stuff out? Should we not? What's going on? They decided to fill out the information, and all those records survived of that. And the Lithuanian Jewish Museum actually got here a book, which is actually the list of all the people in the ghetto, right?
Wow.
And the maps and where they were living. So it's got what their level of education. It's basically their census record, right?
Sure. And what is this book called?
It's the Saudi ghetto list of prisoners, right? So, and it's got information around. It's in Lithuanian, in Russian, and in English. I actually found out that it existed. It's out of print. They're not printing anymore. I tried to find out whether that. I found someone who, when they did the original printing, sent out an email to a listserv right back in the, I think it's like 2006, 2007, like that people could pre-order, right? And I was actually in visiting family in Israel, and had found out about it. There was a copy at UW here at the UW Library at University of Washington, locally, which I got my brother-in-law, who was a graduate from there and had checkout privileges, the ability, he checked it out, and I went and scanned took pictures of all the pages that my grandparents were in, and then wanted to get a copy. And I sent out, like, does anyone have an extra copy? And somebody in New Jersey said, I bought 2. And he's like, I was like, I'll pay for shipping. He's like, no problem. So now I have a copy. But it was incredibly crowded in there. So as an example, I believe, I should look it up because when I do my talk, I've got my little notes. But I believe there's 109 people listed at the same address as my grandfather. I did the math based on square footage of living space in that. They had 16 square feet of space per person. So it's basically, when I show it to kids, I hold my hands out and rotate. And that's about 4 feet by 4 feet. And I'm not holding my hands out completely. I'm holding them at a 90-degree angle. That's 4 feet by 4 feet. That's 16 feet of square feet per person. So not enough, basically enough space for one person to almost lay down, right? And they were incredibly, incredibly hungry. So there was rationing of food, a weekly portion of food, and it always gets a gasp from students because I bring a full week's worth of food. It's 700 grams of black bread, which is, so it's roughly 15 to 18 slices of bread. It's a cup of flour, 2/3 of a cup of beans, and 4 ounces of horse meat. And that's a week's worth of food. It averages out to about 330 calories a day.
And not only were they starving, but they dysentery, lice,
it's a disease infested, and they're going off and doing hard labor, right? I mean, it's not like they were just, and now let's lay in bed all day.
It
right?
says something too about the human desire of survival. That great book by Viktor Frankl is testament to that.
Yeah, and
man's.
Yeah. And I actually don't know if he's related. My grandfather was working at the Frankel leather factory in
I wonder if that's.
I don't know.
He is a psychiatrist.
Yeah, right? I don't know if it. But I
Man's Search for Meaning is the name of the book,
I haven't actually.
and I highly recommend that read. It's tough, but it's a good read. So you're.
My grandparents met in the ghetto there. My grandmother was teaching. It was illegal.
Yeah. Okay.
So the superintendent of schools for Chablis, his diary survived. And he said it was some of the best, most motivated students that they had. The way they hid it by basically moving classrooms around. They hid it by having kids go to school naked. That's not the dress code at any of the schools my kids go to right now. They did it that if they all paid attention, they got, before they got their bath before the Sabbath, before Friday night, they got an extra slice of bread with jelly. So evidently, when you are surviving on 300 calories a day, that's a great motivator to pay attention the rest of the time.
It's amazing to me the brain can even
function in those situations.
Yeah.
So they met in the ghetto. The family friend of my father's, Aryeh, Kalman Lurie, he also knew my grandmother, so he introduced them. So they were kind of.
Wait, I'm sorry.
My grandfather Aryeh and my grandmother Masha met in the ghetto. They were introduced.
This is your mother
on my mom's side. This is all still my mom's side.
Got it. No, I'm glad that you're doing it this way.
Yeah, and it's interesting because. We're now talking late 1941, 1942. My father's side of the family hasn't been affected by anything yet, right? The Germans have there's no ghettos. There's no it's almost kind of like two stories that sort of overlap, but not the timelines don't. So they meet in the ghetto. And my grandfather has, again, the pass to go work outside the ghetto. My grandmother does too, because she's officially listed in the census as a factory worker. She's not, right? She was working as a teacher. This was a ghetto where they were, again, trying to dehumanize people. They had things that they called actions. And an action was basically ask for volunteers. And sometimes those volunteers got extra stuff, and sometimes those volunteers got sent off to a different camp, and sometimes those volunteers just got shot and killed. So you never knew what was going to happen, right? So there were stories of, hey, we need 50 people, and they shot them so that they had room for another 50 people to bring in. But they had heard rumblings that on November 5th, 1943, November 5th, 1943, that there was going to be a big action. Like it kind of had come down through the underground. They didn't know what was going to happen. And the rumblings was anybody who has a pass, as soon as they open the gates, get out. My grandfather and Kalman, so Aryeh and Kalman left to go work in the factory or go out into kind of the woods. My grandmother had a pass, and she said, "No, my job is to stay with the kids, right? I'm a teacher. The parents can go out. I will stay with those kids." Kalman, who ended up being there's family you have and there's family you choose. He's family we've chosen or was chosen. My grandfather passed away before my mom got married. He's the one who gave away my mom at the wedding. But Kalman actually got interviewed by his grandkids about it, and the way he described it is, if there's a hell on earth, this was it. On November 5th, what they did is around 9 o'clock in the morning, they drove a set of trucks into the ghetto, and they said, "Hey, we need the kids, right? Bring out the kids." So kind of the Jewish mayor of the ghetto, like the head person in charge, had an infant toddler, and he brought him out, and they said, "No, bring out the rest of the kids." And they started gathering the kids. By gathering the kids, first they gathered the ones that came and put them in the trucks. They said they were going to move them to a different place. And then they started going door to door. And the kids would be holding on to their parents or be hiding, and they'd grab them and they'd take them. And if they wouldn't let go, they'd club them until they let go and then take them. These are apartment buildings, so it's multi-story. If they're on the third floor and they find a kid and they've clubbed them and gotten them to let go, they don't want to walk them all the way down, so they throw them out the window into the back of the truck. Right? So they gather all the children. I think it's around 700-ish, and then a bunch of elderly, a bunch of disabled, the mayor, the doctor, the superintendent of the schools, and they kind of gather all them together, and they go off, and they all put them on a train to Auschwitz, where they were all killed. Now, my grandmother had kids basically ripped out of her hands. And I mentioned that my grandmother was a teacher. That was the last day she was a teacher. For the rest of her life, on November 5th, she'd shut the door and basically cry the entire day. She couldn't be around big groups of kids. I asked my mom, what did that mean when you came to, when there was parent-teacher night at school? She goes, my mom came, she sat in the corner and cried. My grandmother would come visit us here in the States, and she never came to see me play soccer. I thought it was because I was a bad soccer player. I was. But no, it's just she'd stay with my brother, and she couldn't be around big groups of kids. And it's the types of things that affect you not just in the moment, but affect you for her for the next 60 years, right? So of her life, it was a factor. And she got another career afterwards as an accountant and did a bunch of different things, but she could never be around big groups of kids again. My grandfather and Kalman, basically they hid out in the forest. They came back a couple days later. They heard what had happened, and they basically escaped with my grandmother.
Because Kalman knew her.
Kalman knew her, right? So he introduced them because he had been in the town since the ghetto had been formed and that. I actually don't know exactly how they met, but they basically escaped out into the forest and just lived off the land so this is November of 1943. So it's the start of winter in far Lithuania. Far north Lithuania. It is not it is a cold area. They basically were living in a pigsty, in a charcoal pit, in somebody's barn, in the woods. They would try to build a lean-to, but they'd wait for the lightning to strike so that when they chopped stuff down, it wouldn't make too much noise. They were constantly on the move. My grandfather basically never slept. Was always he always had a go bag till the day he died. Never know when he's going to have to go. Right, so he had enough stuff that he could go live off the land. He couldn't get woken up by an alarm clock because he'd freak out. Right, he couldn't. My mom, her sister, couldn't wake up my grandfather. Only my grandmother could, and it's like, leave. No, it's okay. We're okay. And this is 30 years later, right? 35 years later. So huge kind of trauma that gets impacted by this. And they basically survived in the forest for 7-8 months until July 1944, when the Russians liberated Lithuania. Everyone who was in late June of 1944, everyone who was still in the Shavli ghetto was sent in trains to the Stutthof concentration camp, which was in Poland, in far northern Poland. And my grandparents, though, kind of got liberated. They got a little studio apartment in Shavli and tried to figure out how to get back to they were trying to figure out how to get to Israel. They basically, at that point, though, were constantly had a living room full of orphans, basically, that they were helping take care of and whatnot. So their tragedy begins in June of 1941. In June of 1944, July of 1944, they're liberated, and they're now in reasonable shape. On the flip side, my grandparents on my father's side, their story overlaps in time, but is at a very kind of different chunk. So
if your grandfather, your mother's father, hadn't had those forestry skills, those outdoor skills, they never would have
survived.
No.
If he didn't own the lumber mill, he would have been dead the first time around. If they had stayed in the ghetto, right, that day, who knows what would have happened. When you look across the thing, I've been able to find that I think that there's over 8,000 or 9,000 people that ended up going through the Shavli ghetto. From what I've been able to find as research, it's by no means definitive. Less than 550 people survived for after the war. Even just my grandmother, who didn't, she was in the ghetto when it was formed. She lived through all of that.
Did they have the tattoos?
They did not have the tattoos. They never went. They were never in a concentration camp, right? So they survived in.
So the ghettos, they didn't do that.
They didn't do that, and they didn't do that in all the camps either. They did even in the most famous camps of Auschwitz. My grandparents that went through on the other side, they didn't have the tattoos. It was later in the war they were no longer tattooing. They were processing too many people. They couldn't do it fast enough.
So let's go to Dad's side.
So Dad's side. So Emil and Eva. My grandfather is the youngest of three, and he was sent off to boarding school first, and he met my grandmother because my grandmother's family was my grandmother's father, my great grandfather. Was an incredibly bad businessman. So this was before the war. He failed at general store, he failed at farming, failed at like everything. And she came from a pretty religious family. So he met her when she came through the town where he was doing boarding school. And then when he finished up school and he had to do mandatory military service for Romania at the time, he ended up in Aryeh, which was the town where my grandmother's family lived. So he had heard they were distant cousins of some sort. He knew that they were there, so he went looking up to get free meals. Right, like, hey, I can get a home cooked meal when I'm out here. Now, my grandmother on one side, Masha, was the most educated. Right, she went to teaching college on my mom's side. Yeah. She was went to teaching, like university teaching college was pretty darn rare in the 1930s for a woman to be able to do. On the other side, my grandmother is the least educated. So she had a younger brother and older brother. They were from a religious family, so it was very important for the men to study the Torah and to be appropriately religious studies. So since my great-grandfather was really bad at actually helping to support the family, she dropped out in third grade and started working as a seamstress. And she continued doing work in alterations and that into her late 70s in New York. Right, so she did
my
that.
grandmother, my father's mom, was a seamstress in New York.
So she was.
Must be a Jewish woman thing.
It was one of the skills that they picked up and they were able to do, and they could. There was always a demand for it, even just to to create your own clothes and stuff.
And I don't think my grandmother Sylvia was very educated either.
Yeah, no, I think it was one of those where. And the other thing is, New York actually, in the early 1900s, when the Jews came in. When there was a bunch of immigration of Jews, one of the areas that they kind of clustered was in the garment industry in New York. So she didn't ever get involved in the official industry. She came over after my grandfather passed away and whatnot, but she kind of did side alterations and stuff out of her apartment. I mean, she did clothes for us and clothes for herself and things like that. But she was a very pretty lady. I have pictures of her from before the war and whatnot. And my grandfather was infatuated with her, and he was trying to woo her and whatnot. Now he finished up his military service. He ended up. He was from a place called Suplac in Romania. It is about 10 or 12 miles from Sighișoara, which is where Count Vlad Dracul was born. So it's Transylvania. It's truly Transylvania. I went back and visited it with my dad for my dad's 65th birthday and whatnot, and we went around. And the house where he grew up is still there. The town still does not have running water, right? It has electricity now, but it's still all outhouses and that. You've heard of a one stoplight town. This one doesn't even have a stop sign, right? I went back, I guess it's like 8 years ago now, so in 2010 and or 2011, and there were still almost as many horse and buggies around as there were cars, right? It's all subsistence farming and that. Now, my grandfather's family, for the town, ran the town bar out of their front room. So he was basically going around and doing wine sales and beer sales and liquor sales to go gather stuff from all the local areas. So he was kind of more moving around. So he ended up back in Aryeh. They had heard things were getting kind of bad. So he ended up trying there in May of 1944. Again, now they'd heard that things were really bad for single women. So he had been trying to convince my grandmother to marry him for a while, but he didn't want like a big religion. He wasn't from as religious a family, so he didn't want to get involved in all that. He actually is there in the beginning of May May of 1944, May 5th, 1944 is when they create the ghetto in Oradea. Oradea is a town right on the border between Romania and Hungary. Still, even today, still primarily Hungarian speaking there. Before World War I, ended, it was all part of Hungary, right? So
So did she say yes to him, knowing that no?
She was continuously. Now, I got stories. So my grandmother actually. So after Schindler's List came out, there was a big effort to record as many of the stories as possible. There was a project called the Shoah Project that was sponsored by Steven Spielberg and by University of Southern California, and she got interviewed for that. So that I actually have some firsthand knowledge. It's all in Hungarian, so I had to get it all translated. So my dad went through and translated as much of it as he could for me. She told the story of she was really not impressed when he was coming over to dinner at her family's house, and he had been already wooing her for a while, but he'd bring another girl with him. So yeah, he was a bit of a player from my understanding. He was a really good. My mom. He was a very jovial guy. He died when I was about 5 years old, but he was always dancing, always full of life. He was exactly what you would expect an alcohol salesman to be able to do. But he got stuck in the ghetto when the ghetto basically got closed off. So this is a much bigger city. So the city is about 100,000 people. Over a third of the people are Jewish. So they took a third of the people, put them in about 6% of the space. Right? Again, super, super crowded. And finally she breaks down and says, fine, I'll marry you, while they're in the ghetto there. So they got married on May 20th, 1944, in the ghetto in Oradea. And they got, instead of having a small civil wedding, they got a big religious wedding with everybody from the apartment buildings and that, about 300 people at the wedding, big thing. But they received a great honor that the rabbi basically gave them his office as their honeymoon suite, right? And we didn't know exactly what day they got married. But when I went through my grandmother's kind of testimony when she did that, she said they got married, and on the fourth day after they got married, the train started running out of Aryeh. So I've been able to find the records of when the train started running out of Aryeh, which is on May 24th.
Let them know what the trains mean.
So the trains is, they started deporting people from Aryeh, and they put them on these cattle cars, and they sent them to Auschwitz, Auschwitz-Birkenau. Now, on May 27th is the day that my grandparents were sent. So my grandmother tells the story. So one of these cars is about 25 feet long, about 8 feet wide. So probably roughly the size of this room, maybe not quite as wide as this conference table that we're doing it at here, maybe a little bit longer, maybe the length of the room. They were on one that wasn't super crowded. It was only about 80 people in that space with their belongings, right? So with their suitcases, with their stuff. So my grandmother's there, my grandfather's there, her parents are there, one of her brothers is there. Her other brother was doing military service in Bucharest, so he was not there. Her aunts and uncles, like everyone from the surrounding apartment, right? So all the family and that were there. There's a bucket of water on one end. There's a bucket to take care of your business on the other end. And they are basically crammed like this for 2.5 days on a train ride to Auschwitz. They pull up in the middle of the night and they get parked, and they disembark the next morning, and they are immediately separated into men go this way, women go that way. My grandmother tells the story. So she had sewn special stuff into her to hide stuff in her shirt and in her jacket. They got stopped actually on the border with Austria, and guards came through and ripped and took any jewelry, took whatever they could find. So she had stuff. She was able to actually, the stuff that was hidden still survived from that. But she gets to Auschwitz. She tells the story that she looks around for her mom and can't find her mom because her mom put on an extra, was like, oh no, they'd heard rumblings that you only get to keep what you were wearing. So it's May, it's actually pretty warm. in May of 1944 in Poland at this point in time. But they put on extra layers because everything else is going to be taken away. So her mom is putting on like an extra jacket. She gets separated from her. It's chaos, right? 80 people are trying to get out of a cattle car. She looks around, doesn't see her, so she gets put down the path of the. She's in her mid-20s at the time. I think she's 23. So she was born. Yeah, 20. Right around 23, 24.
Kid, just a baby.
Yeah, and so she gets separated out. All the older people get sent straight to the gas chambers. So the fact that my great-grandmother put on an extra jacket is the reason I'm here. Anybody who wanted to stay, this was May of 1944, they didn't need that many slave laborers anymore. So anybody who wanted to stay with the adults that were going to the gas chambers got to stay. That was the last time my grandmother saw her parents. That was the last time she saw I think her grandparents were on that.
So the extra coat because
they got separated. So she got sent down one line as opposed to going in the line with her mom.
And her mom was.
Her mom went straight to the gas chambers.
Right.
Which she didn't realize at the time, right? Like my grandmother didn't even realize what exactly had happened there. My grandmother got sent to the Auschwitz I labor camp, which was a labor camp for women there. So she had her head shaved, her hair shaved off, given kind of prison garb, and given, which I just found out, as far as kind of crazy random stories, Billy Joel's family was escaped right before the war, but they were manufacturers of uniforms and that, and the factories of Billy Joel's family was used to do all of the.
They had commandeered.
The Nazis had commandeered and used that to build all of the clothing for the inmates in the concentration camps. I just found that out a couple months ago, which was kind of crazy. Mm-hmm. So she got separated out there. She had good shoes, so she got to keep her shoes. So that was considered something that was very important. And that my grandfather gets separated out with the men. He actually goes with my grandmother's younger brother, and they get off sent to their own processing and whatnot.
Is that because they were young and strong?
They were in good shape, right? They were of working age, so they can still be used as slave labor, and that's literally what they were being used for. They got processed, and I have the processing card of basically when they got processed in Auschwitz.
I would love all these photographs.
Yeah, so
I'll put them on all the social media so people can see
I'll pass them along with the sources of where I got them and all of that fun, not fun stuff, but stuff that I've got. And this is the one where I also have Elie Wiesel's, and it's processed on the same day. In Auschwitz. Now, they were on different trains. They were coming from slightly different locations. He was from a different town in Transylvania than my grandparents were from. But they got separated out. My grandmother, at this point, gets spent about a couple months in Auschwitz in the labor camp, and then in August gets sent to Stutthof, which was... So this is August of 1944. I mentioned earlier, in June of 1944, everybody who was still alive in the Shavli ghetto had been sent to the Stutthof camp. Now, the Stutthof camp did not have gas chambers. It was a camp where they killed you the old-fashioned way. They just worked you to death. Again, very, very limited food. My grandmother's job was to basically repair an airfield, which meant moving boulders by day. And then they'd get some rotten turnip soup at night if they did it. Stutthof also had massive amounts of people died just from overworking them and not feeding them enough. It was also one where they didn't do as much of the medical experiments that happened in Auschwitz, but instead there was a luxury item, which was soap from the fat from Jewish bodies that had passed away. So that was the claim to fame of the Stutthof camp.
Was to be able to sell soap made of the Jews' fat, the rendering.
Yep. So, yeah. So she survived there until January, late January of 1945. So if you look at kind of maps of it, Stutthof is not very far from Lithuania, right? So it's in far northern Poland. The Russians had already liberated Lithuania in that summer, right? Before my grandmother got there. So they were probably 100, 150 miles away. And they were making slow and steady progress off of their, I guess it's their the Germans' eastern front. In January, late January, the Germans realized that the camp was going to get overrun. So they basically wanted to keep as much of the slave labor as they could. So they started basically taking everyone and they gave everyone a loaf of bread and started marching them west. So this is one of the death marches. The term death march got coined as part of what happened in the Holocaust as part of World War II. And my grandmother, again, so she claims that one of the reasons she survived is she had her shoes still, right? So she had a decent pair of shoes. They didn't, over 10,000 people started the death march. Less than half survived the march. Just over 50% fatality on the march. They didn't waste bullets on you. Like, it's the middle of the winter in far northern Poland. If you fell sick on the side, they left you. If you tried to run off, fine, you'll freeze to death. They didn't. If they got lucky, they got to sleep in a barn. Normally, they just had to sleep out in the weather, and the Germans would commandeer the farmhouses and the barns and that for themselves. After about 6 weeks of this, so early March, my grandmother says, "I just can't do it anymore," and crawls into one of the barns and hides behind hay bales. And the Germans don't try to gather people up. They're trying to stay ahead of the Russians who are liberating right behind them. There's 8 Lithuanian men there. I don't know if any of them are from the Shavli ghetto, but there's a decent chance that there's some overlapping there. My grandmother is sick, very, very hungry, just can't go any
and
further.
Hasn't seen her husband.
She hasn't seen her husband at this point in 6 months. She hasn't seen her parents. She doesn't know what's going on. She has somebody that she survived with in Stutthof that she basically hides with at this point. And later the same day, the Russians liberate her. That's how close behind the Russians were at that point in time. She gets sent to like some medical camps and that. And she doesn't know where to go, right? She doesn't know what's going to happen. She starts, they started using, as the war ended and that, the same train lines to send people back.
Can you imagine having to get back on a freaking train?
So she gets back on a train. She is actually switching trains at Auschwitz because they'd run all the trains through, like the train tracks were set up to go that way, right? So that... and she is in Auschwitz on the day that she finds out that the war ends. So on VE Day, and then she continues on to Oradea, back to the same place where they were living beforehand. And she kind of just I believe it's beginning of April of 1945. So her entire story. From when the ghetto got started and she's back living in Aryeh is less than a year. On the other side, they were 3 years between ghettos and living in the forest and that. And they were pretty much freed by the time.
And she's 23, 24?
Yeah, so she was
I keep saying this, but imagine when I was 23, I tried to imagine who I was in that mind space, and having to experience that is insane.
Yeah, so she was born in 1916, I believe it is. So, it's kind of nuts.
So she's back.
She's back, doesn't know what happened. She, at this point, she found out about the gas chambers and stuff in Auschwitz, so she knows that her parents are probably dead. She does not know what happened to her brother. She does not know what happened to her husband. So we switch gears now to what happened to Emil. Emil was he didn't talk about much about what happened. He told stories to my dad about a couple different things. There's things that we know. We know he was sent to Auschwitz. I have records of that. I know he was liberated from Buchenwald. I have records of that. He told stories about doing synthetic oil. Being forced to basically create gas, right? So there was a process that I found out when I started doing the research to turn coal into gas, because gas for the planes and for the tanks and that was hugely important. And he also claimed, hey, he figured out how to survive in the camps. He didn't know how to dodge bombs. So he was more scared about Allies bombing where he's working, almost than how does he survive on little food and this and that. Now, my great uncle, my grandmother's brother, credits him with keeping him alive. He was very religious. He was, I need to keep kosher and that. My grandfather forced him to eat stuff, right? He forced him to do stuff. And so the research I've been able to do is I was able to find that there was, so I know my grandfather spent a bunch of time in Buchenwald, officially at that. There was a satellite camp of Buchenwald that's called Lutzendorf, which was a petroleum facility. And that's one of the places, I was able to find the U.S. Army records, that's one of the places where they did synthetic oil. So I don't know for sure that that's where he was working, but there's a decent chance of that. And this is one of the things that I always find interesting when I talk to kids and tell my story is, here's the stuff I know that I have records of, and here's the stuff I don't know, right? And here's the stuff I'm making guesses. It's an interesting thing of, I just literally last week got more records. So I actually have I had one record that showed he was in Buchenwald, but I have another one now with like what were his belongings when he arrived there. And I have other records that I don't understand what they are. They came from the International Tracking Service in Arleston, which is the biggest repository of, where basically all of the information from the Holocaust that any of the countries found, that it's the big foundings there. When I did the research even 2 years ago, none of their stuff was online. So sometime in 2019 they started putting stuff online. So I have my DNA test that I have up on 23andMe and whatnot. And you get some smart matches, and they said, oh, there's some new data. So I was able to find some new information actually this last week, some new records of this. That's where I got actually my grandmother's record from Stutthof. I know that she told us it was in Stutthof, but now I have the actual kind of prisoner record and what her number was there. Now, the Allies bombed a ton, Lutzendorf. I believe that when I've been able to do the research, is either 11 or 13 different bombing runs there.
So your grandfather is not only trying to stay alive from starvation, but he's bombs.
So they, at the beginning of the war, the petroleum facilities were basically completely run by the Germans. By the end of the war, it was 98% slave labor, because it was a heavy Allied target for the war effort, and which makes a lot of sense, but it did not make it any easier. The last run there was on April 8th, 1945. Why is that important? Because on April 11th, the U.S. Army liberated Buchenwald. And there's some very famous photos there of with including Elie Wiesel and that. And actually, I first got introduced to the Holocaust Center here in Seattle when I guess it was almost 12 years ago. It'll be 12 years ago in February, when there's a local gentleman named Leo Hymas. He passed away about 3 or 4 years ago, but he was one of the liberators of Buchenwald. And he was doing a talk at the Bellevue Public Library here, and it was the first time I think I left my daughter to go to hey, I've got something that I need to go do. So I went to go hear the talk, and afterwards I went up to him and said, well, one of the people that you liberated is my grandfather. Years later, he was a speaker that went around to schools and places here. I would see him when we did the speakers' lunches and when we had kind of our annual fundraiser. And I got into the habit of letting him know, between my great uncle and my grandfather, the two people that I know that were at Buchenwald that were liberated by him and others, what does the family tree of number of people that now are alive look like. And at last count, I think it was something like 86 of people that were born because of just out of those two people, right? So it's kind of crazy from that perspective. My grandfather gets liberated by the Americans. Now my great uncle is super sick and gets sent to American hospital, basically a deportation or resettlement camp, and gets medical aid and is nourished back to health there. My grandfather, on the other hand, steals a bike from the American Army. I believe the statute of limitations on that has passed. But he steals a bike and starts biking back. So now he has been, from May 27th was when they were put on the train. April 11th is the day he's liberated. And
he doesn't talk about Auschwitz at all, right?
He didn't. Not that I know of, right? My dad doesn't remember any stories on it. Don't know how much time he spent in Auschwitz. I don't know when he got to Buchenwald. It seems like it's relatively quick because he did a lot of. So all of this again under a year, but under a year of starvation, hard labor, slave labor. He steals a bike and starts biking. It's roughly 800 miles back to Romania, right, to Aryeh. He told the story of he gets to Vienna, his bike gets stolen from him, so he steals another bike, and then he gets back to Aryeh on May 20th, 1945. 1 year to the day after he married my grandmother, and knocks on the door and is reunited with my grandmother. And that's the first time she knew that he still survived, right? Now, when I tell the story, I start out with a bunch of statistics for the kids. And one of the statistics I use, what's the odds that you win the Mega Millions, right? The jackpot. And there it's about 360 million. And I say I don't play the jackpot because I've won my lottery here. But if I did, the numbers 5 and 20 are ones I'd pick. It's the May 20th, 1944 is when my grandparents were married. May 20th, 1945 is when my grandparents were reunited. May 20th, 1946 is when my father was born. And I'm hoping that no one tries the garage code for my parents' house, because I think I just gave it away.
I think about the idea of, God, what an emotional story. It's, sorry.
Oh, no.
I think about the idea of when you see concrete, mm-hmm. and then every once in a while there's a flower mm-hmm. that pops up through the concrete. And I think, yes, that is the will to live right there. And that's what
it's the will, it's the luck, right? I mean, what happened? Like, why did my great-grandmother put on a jacket? Why was my grandfather so stubborn that he wasn't willing to convert, right? Why did it, and the more I learn, the more I find out, why did someone help out in this particular situation that they were able to get food here or that? I don't. There's a luck. There's will to survive. My level of complaining about traffic has gone way down after learning and researching as much of of my grandparents' story as I could. But it's incredible. And that's so that's the stories of how each of them survived the war. They all ended up. So my grandparents on my mom's side ended up actually smuggling themselves as refugees to try to get to Israel. So they were crossing in the middle of the night through European countries. Where have we heard that recently? Bribing guards. They crossed the Alps into Italy in late 1945 or early 1946. Actually, early mid 1946. And my grandmother is rappelling right through the Alps. 5 months pregnant with my mom.
Oh my God.
After all this. So my mom was born in a refugee camp outside Milan in Italy. When I hear about stuff going on in refugee, people that are seeking asylum and people that are running away, well, I've got pictures of my mom in a hospital, in a refugee camp there. One of the records I was actually just able to find last week was the record from the UN relief agency that was running kind of those refugee camps for my grandparents. So what languages did they speak? Where did they? Where were they? That? And then they have multiple spots where, hey, we checked in with them there. We checked in with them there, and then they're missing. And the reason they're missing is they actually got smuggled into Palestine before it was Palestine. Before it was Israel.
Yeah.
And they were, since my grandfather was of kind of fighting age, and my grandmother had knowledge of Hebrew, knowledge of stuff, because she knew from her sister, because they traversed, and because she had a baby. So my grandmother's job when they got to Haifa, city in Israel where they disembarked, is her job was to basically talk to the British customs person and prove that they were actually all people that were legally allowed to come in. They were all on fake paperwork, and just about nobody knew anything about it. They were all survivors. And her job was to kind of fake it while my mom was in her 10 months old in her arms, because nobody would be faking that they're fighters and that with a baby until they got it. So that's how they got to Israel. And then my grandparents on the other side, they actually stayed in Romania for.
Wait, I'm sorry. Go back to that. They were your grandmother was, or I'm sorry, your great aunt was trying to convince the.
No, so my grandmother. My grandmother was basically.
She had the baby.
She had the baby, my mom, in her arms. And she's trying to talk to the customs guys and she's showing, since she understands a little bit of the language, she was the one that was speaking to the customs person and handing over all the paperwork, while all the people that don't speak any of the language and can't
sneaking by
and have no knowledge of Israel, they're all people coming back to Israel, right? She can talk about this village or that because she knows some stuff from that from her sister. So she's kind of just.
She's being the smoke and mirrors.
She's being the smoke and mirrors while everybody else kind of goes through. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of crazy from that perspective. So she does all of that. They ended up settling in Israel, in a town called Aryeh, in the north, a resort town. That's where I spent a bunch of summers growing up. It was great, 3 blocks from the beach. I had a great time with it. My other grandparents, they went back to the Transylvania area, to Tirgomorish, where my father was born. My grandfather was. This was now under communist rule, and Ceausescu was basically a tyrant there. They got thrown. My grandfather got thrown in jail because they thought that he was still doing kind of wine sales. And that there were some relatives that had a lot of money that maybe if they threw him in jail, they'd come back and bail him out. My father was very sick, and as a little kid, he had an appendicitis, and when they did the appendectomy, they left like a sponge in there, so he got infected and like all kinds of stuff. And they were trying to get, a bunch of their family tried to get to Palestine. They all got put in deportation camps in Cyprus, refugee camps in Cyprus, and then until Israel was formed, they weren't able to get in. But my grandparents were still in Romania, and then they wanted to leave, but they weren't allowed out for about 7 years. And there it's also a crazy story of how they were allowed out. My grandparents, my father, they had an apartment that was basically right across the street from the pool, the town pool in Tirgomorish. And they'd been asking to leave for, I think it's 6-7 years at this point in time, and kept getting visa denied. The chief of police, his son graduated high school. He was an avid swimmer, wanted an apartment of his own. He wanted to move out of his parents' house. Looked at the set of people that were asking to leave, saw that there was an apartment right across the street from the pool, said, I want that one, and they had 48 hours to leave. So again, it was pack up all their stuff, get on a train that went through Oradea to Vienna. They get stopped again at the border. Now my grandmother's having flashbacks, but they get on a plane to Israel, and that my parents met in high school there.
Unbelievable.
So that's the story.
Not unbelievable.
Well,
I hate even using that word because I know that there are people out there that say, "Oh, this doesn't happen," and so that makes me crazy.
It's incredible.
It is incredible.
It's incredible. Astronomical. And stories like this, unfortunately, continue to happen, or fortunately continue to happen. Right? It's unfortunate that they have to happen. It's fortunate that people still have the will and capability to survive. And be able to do things like that. And I like to think that when I go and tell the story, kids study a little bit of it. They read Dyer Van Frank or they read Knight. What I can do is provide kind of a personal narrative around it and put real people, real faces, real stories behind that. And we're getting to the point where, 10 years from now, the number of survivors that will be able to go out and speak they're dwindling, right?
Sure.
The youngest of them are in their late 70s, early 80s, and those were the child survivors. There are very few that are continuing able to go speak, and I'm for the group that I work at, volunteer with here. I was the first of the third generation to go speak, so that told my grandparents' stories. But I kind of view it as that's my responsibility and my honor to tell those stories. And I like to think that it makes a difference. I get some pretty neat cards from students and that afterwards.
We have to repeat the stories, because if we don't, if the stories get lost, history is on a continual loop, doomed to repeat itself. Mm-hmm. So these stories are imperative.
They're imperative, and Elie Wiesel actually has a quote about why he tells the story, and talks about it. And he says, because if you don't tell the stories, it would be akin to killing them a second time.
Well said. How can people reach out to you if they want to talk to you? Through
the Holocaust Center's website, and that they can get people in contact. We offer, basically, I go out to speak. It's a completely volunteer thing. Schools don't have to pay to have people come in. They send out materials and books and artifacts and that to schools all across the Pacific Northwest. And there are similar organizations around the United States and around the world.
Yeah.
So it's crazy for me to think that, so I do, at Microsoft here, I am a geek. I've gone and spoken at a bunch of developer conferences, talking to other geeks, and the realization that I've now got a presentation that I could probably be giving for the next 40 years is kind of nuts. But even last week, I got new artifacts and new stuff that I need to put into the slides, so it'll be a different talk next time.
And you'll teach your children, and they hopefully will carry on the tradition. So
my daughter has heard me speak now a couple times, and she actually, we did a talk for kind of family and friends that they knew I did this, but had never heard it. And we were driving home from it afterwards, and she said, do you think I'll be allowed to tell the talk afterwards? On the other hand, she's like, if you come talk at my school, I've heard it already. So I was like, oh, that's okay. But
the other kids haven't.
The other kids haven't.
Yeah. So. Arik, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, it's, wow.
It's a crazy story.
Yeah. Thanks for listening, everyone. Thanks for listening. Please rate and review Hey Human Podcast on iTunes.